David Davis.
Deputy Speaker. Let me start with a comment really relating to what the Honourable Lady who's just spoken raised, the question of really the duty on governments to be more than fair when they're dealing with electoral legislation. Governments should not, even by accident, put in place electoral legislation that advantages themselves against their opponents. But I will have to say to her that the most egregious example of that was under Gordon Brown. The more sanctimonious the minister, the worse the outcome sometimes. But it's also incumbent on us to make sure that we don't even accidentally disadvantage the other side in the elections. And I want to focus on just one thing today, which is this issue of voter ID. Now, the very fact it's got ID in the word will tell everybody I'm against it, so we understand that. But it's not for the conventional reasons. This is not an ID system with a database behind it. This is just an ID card that you have to present. And you know, our country over the centuries has been different from other countries. We do not allow our policemen to come up to you and say, "Can I see your papers, please?" And that distinction between a citizen and the state is important to maintain, particularly when we're talking about the absolute fundamental rights of the individual, the right to vote. Now, we've heard this battle's already occurred to some extent. The government claims that voter fraud undermines our democracy, and that's quite right. But the primary voter fraud has been in postal votes. Not impersonation, it's in postal votes. And we all know how it's occurred in communities and up and down the country. And we should deal with that ruthlessly and prosecute them. And I say to my honourable friend, who used to serve me as a minister in the Brexit department, that, that the answer to his question is the prosecution should happen in his constituency. That's what should happen. But let's be clear. I mean, only since 2014, only 3 prosecutions, about 30-odd allegations, but about only 3 prosecutions have happened. That's out of many tens of millions of votes cast. So 30-odd allegations, 3 prosecutions, 0 elections outcomes influenced by it. That's the thing we have to bear in mind. Now, on the back of that, ministers want to introduce mandatory voter identification. It's an illiberal solution, unsurprisingly coming from the Cabinet Office. That's what it always thinks up, in search of a non-existing problem. Now, I see I've got at least some support on this side. Now, let's go to the government research. Government research itself found that those with disabilities, the unemployed, people without qualifications, people who've never voted before, ethnic minorities, were all less likely to hold any form of ID. That's the sort of groups we're talking about. 2 groups of them, the over 85s and the disabled, had between 5 and 10% of them with no ID. Right? That's the no photo ID. The Joint Committee on Human Rights has warned that the introduction of voter ID may have a discriminatory effect on those groups and other protected groups. And that trial that was referred to, I think, by the Liberal spokesman, where 700 people didn't vote as a result of being required voter ID. That was in an area or set of areas where these groups were very, very low. You know, this is the Southern English test area, basically, not Central Bradford or wherever. So this is very serious. We're talking about a quite significant fraction of our population. Those groups I've described are 2 million people. 2 million people who will have to be met by some ID system. 2 million people balanced against 3 voter convictions. That's the problem we're facing.
Well, right on the road,
of course.
I wonder if my right honourable friend has actually looked at the Schedule 1 within the bill. It's a very, very broad list of valid identification means. I'd be very surprised if there were hardly anybody in the country today who did not have one of those, and he knows of the provision of a free ID from the local council.
The point I make to him is this was government research I'm quoting. He says, no, I didn't do this research, it's government research. And by the way, since he draws me to government research, Eric Pickles, sorry, I've forgotten his title in the other house, but Eric Pickles did an old friend of mine, real old pal of mine, did a study on this. I read it. I have to tell you that if I can summarise the conclusion, there's no evidence I can find for personation, but that doesn't mean it isn't happening. And of course, if it isn't happening, well, it might happen in the future. It's a precautionary principle gone mad, you know, in the centre of our constitution. Anyway, the government's answer, as we've heard several times, is free photographic ID. But nevertheless, the government's own research again found that about 42% of the people without the ID will not take it up. Now, this is really very serious. These groups are going to be disenfranchised because they don't take that up, and they'll turn up at the polling station and find themselves unable to vote. This in pursuit of 3 convictions. Let's... all right, I'll give away one last time.
He's making an excellent speech and thoroughly destroying the government's case for voter ID. Would he care to hazard a guess as to why the government is pursuing this policy?
This is where I differ from him, you see, because I think the government's trying to do its best. Partly. I don't actually think this is a deliberate action. But I think the pressure on government, and he laughs, but I lived through a Labour government deliberately gerrymandering the system, frankly, so I don't want to take any lectures on that, you know. But I think the government's trying to do its best. It's got the wrong idea in pursuit of a problem that doesn't exist, but nevertheless it's trying to do its best. But there is a greater responsibility...
Not a point of order. I really don't want the debate interrupted by points of order that are actually points of debate.
I'll take another day to give lectures on points of order, but the simple truth here is there's a greater responsibility on government than anybody else to do the right thing and to avoid errors working to its own advantage. And that's what I'm arguing here today. This voter ID scheme is an illiberal idea in pursuit of a non-existent problem. And that's what we need to address, and we need to get rid of it, and that's what I'll seek to do in the report stage of this bill.